In the Baghdad Museum, two pieces of an ancient sword are kept, found beneath the floor of the mosque in Kufa. The metal has not decomposed over 1,400 years, contains traces of meteoritic iron and elements in proportions impossible for the 7th century. A guard swears he has seen the pieces glow green at night and shift within the sealed display case. Scientists cannot explain how this metal was made. If this truly is Zulfiqar, the sword of Ali that refused to kill the innocent and shattered from grief at its master's death, then what technology created it 1,400 years ago? In Medina, in the year 2 of the Hijra, at dawn after the Battle of Badr, when the desert sand was still dark with the blood of 313 Muslims and nearly 1,000 Quraysh who had clashed in the first great battle of Islam, the Prophet Muhammad stood among the fallen and looked upon the body of Abu Jahl, leader of the enemies, whose head had been severed so cleanly it seemed as though an invisible blade of pure light had passed through flesh and bone, leaving no jagged edges, creating no torn margins. Beside the body lay a sword, and this was no ordinary sword of Arabian warriors, not those curved blades of Damascus steel with which desert Bedouins fought. This was a straight sword with a forked point, 2 prongs at the end like a serpent's tongue, and its hilt was wrapped with golden wire inlaid with stones that even in the pre-dawn twilight emanated a strange luminescence. Not reflected light, but something emanating from within the metal itself. The Prophet lifted this sword, and those who stood nearby swore afterward that the moment his hand touched the hilt, the air around him trembled as if from an invisible wave of heat, and a scent like musk and amber filled the space, so strong it overcame the stench of blood and death saturating the battlefield. The Prophet held the sword for some time, studying it, and on his face was an expression his companions rarely saw, a mixture of awe and understanding of something hidden from others. Then he called Ali ibn Abi Talib, his cousin and son-in-law, a youth of 22 years, who in this battle had fought so fiercely that he killed more enemies than any other warrior, whose white cloak was red with others' blood, whose face was covered with dust and caked blood, but in whose eyes burned a fire that had not been extinguished even after hours of unceasing combat. The Prophet extended the sword to Ali and spoke words that were recorded later by numerous historians, but whose meaning was understood differently depending on who told the story. He said, "Take this sword, O Ali, and know that this is no ordinary weapon. This is Zulfiqar, and it will serve you as long as you serve truth, as long as your heart is pure, as long as your hand is raised only against those who deserve punishment. But if you ever raise it against an innocent person, even by mistake, it will refuse to serve you, and you will know the weight of justice that cannot be deceived." Ali took the sword, and at the moment his fingers closed around the hilt, those who witnessed it recounted that the sword flared for an instant with such bright light that eyes had to be squeezed shut, and when the light faded, the sword appeared ordinary. But Ali stood transformed, as if something had been transmitted to him through this weapon, some knowledge, some responsibility, the weight of which was visible in his eyes. From that day, Zulfiqar became inseparable from Ali. He wore it always, even when there was no war, even in peacetime. The sword hung at his belt, and people grew accustomed to seeing him thus. Ali with the forked sword, a symbol that became associated with him as closely as his name. But strange things began to happen, things that were whispered about first quietly among close friends, then louder. until rumors reached the enemies of Islam, those who were planning new wars, new battles against the growing community of believers. It was said that Ali's sword was alive, that it possessed will, intelligence, the ability to distinguish right from wrong, innocent from guilty. It was said that if Ali in the heat of battle swung at a person who did not deserve death, the sword became incredibly heavy, so heavy that even Ali, known for his strength, could not bring it down, was forced to stop the blow, spare the opponent. These stories seemed fantastical, exaggerations typical of legends that always surround great warriors, great men, transforming them from ordinary mortals into mythological heroes. But there were too many witnesses, too many people who swore they had seen it with their own eyes, and even enemies, those who survived battles against Ali, confirmed the strange properties of his sword, told how they saw Ali begin a strike, then suddenly stop, as if hitting an invisible wall, how the sword in his hand froze in the air, trembled but did not descend, and Ali would step back, leaving the opponent alive though he could easily have killed him. One such opponent, a man named Amr ibn Abd Wud, one of the greatest warriors of Arabia who fought Ali in single combat during the Battle of the Trench, told afterward, before his death at Ali's hand in that same duel, how at a certain moment he saw Ali's sword hovering above his head, and he was certain the next instant would be his last, but the sword did not descend. Ali stopped, looked at him with an expression resembling surprise, and stepped back as if he had seen something others did not see. Amr used this pause to attack again, and the fight continued, ending in his death. But before dying, he told those nearby that in that moment when the sword hovered over him, he felt something strange, as if someone invisible had stopped the blade, as if between him and death stood a barrier that even Zulfiqar could not or would not overcome. And this gave him a chance, though unused, a chance to survive that others did not receive against whom Ali fought. This story, told by a dying warrior, a man who had no reason to lie in the last minutes of his life, strengthened belief that Ali's sword truly possessed properties beyond ordinary weapons, that it was not simply a piece of metal sharpened for killing, but something greater, an instrument of divine justice that refused to serve injustice even when injustice was committed accidentally, by mistake, in the chaos of battle where it is difficult to distinguish friend from foe, innocent from guilty. Years passed, Islam spread, battles followed one after another, and Ali fought in all of them, always in the front ranks, always with Zulfiqar in hand, and the sword became ever more legendary, accumulating stories, each more incredible than the previous, but each told by people who swore they were witnesses. It was said that in the Battle of Khaybar, when Muslims besieged the Jewish fortress, Ali, with one strike of Zulfiqar, split the massive gates made of wood, a cubit thick, bound with iron, gates that required the efforts of 20 men to open them, and split them so cleanly that the halves fell in different directions as if they were made not of wood and iron, but of papyrus. It was said that the sword never dulled, however often Ali used it. The blade remained sharp, capable of cutting a hair that fell upon it, capable of slicing through 3 layers of chainmail as if it were fabric. But the strangest stories concerned not the sword's strength, not its sharpness, but its ability to discern, its seemingly impossible property of knowing people's intentions, knowing their guilt or innocence. After the Prophet's death, when the Muslim community split, when internal conflicts began, civil wars, brother against brother, Ali found himself at the center of these conflicts. First, as one of the claimants to the caliphate, then as the 4th caliph, ruler of the growing empire, but a ruler whose authority was contested, against whom former comrades, former friends rose up. The most painful of these conflicts was the Battle of Siffin in the year 37 of the Hijra, when Ali's army, about 90,000 men, clashed with the army of Muawiyah, ruler of Syria, who refused to recognize Ali's caliphate, demanded retribution for the blood of Uthman, the previous caliph, killed by rebels. This was not a battle against unbelievers, not a holy war against those who denied Islam. This was tragedy Muslims against Muslims, people who prayed in one direction, read one Quran, followed one prophet, but could not agree on who should rule, who was right, who was guilty of the blood that had been spilled. Both armies stood on the banks of the Euphrates, separated by the river, and for several days simply looked at each other. No one wanted to begin because everyone knew this would be slaughter, that thousands would die, that victory, if achieved at all, would be Pyrrhic, would leave such a wound in the heart of the Ummah that would never heal. Ali spent the night before battle in prayer. He did not sleep, stood on his knees on his prayer mat spread on the riverbank, and prayed with tears flowing down his face, prayed so passionately, so desperately, that those standing guard nearby heard his sobs, heard how he begged Allah not to let him kill a single innocent person, not to let him raise the sword against one who did not deserve death, to give him a sign, show him the way to avoid this catastrophe, how to stop the bloodshed. He prayed all night until dawn began to break, until the sky in the east began to pink, heralding sunrise. And when the first rays of sun touched the earth, touched the place where Ali stood, something happened that thousands of people saw that could not be hallucination, could not be invention. Zulfiqar, hanging at Ali's belt, began to glow at, first weakly, barely noticeably, then brighter, ever brighter, until it emitted light green, bright, pulsating, so intense it hurt to look directly at it. The light was visible at enormous distance. Muawiyah's army, standing on the opposite bank of the river, a mile from Ali's army, saw this light, saw how it rose from the place where the caliph stood, saw how it pulsed in a rhythm resembling a heartbeat. Muawiyah's warriors looked upon this phenomenon with growing horror, because they understood this was not natural light, not a torch, not fire. This was something else, something they could not explain, but which inspired awe-filled fear that paralyzed will, took away desire to fight. Many of Muawiyah's warriors, seeing this green light emanating from Ali's sword, threw down their weapons right there, on the spot, refused to go into battle, saying they would not fight against a man blessed by the heavens, against a man whose sword glowed with light that could only be divine. Commanders tried to stop the desertion, threatened, promised rewards, but nothing helped because fear of divine punishment was stronger than fear of earthly commanders, stronger than thirst for reward. By the time battle was to begin, Muawiyah's army had lost about a third of its forces, not from combat, but from desertion, from refusal to fight against one whom the heavens themselves seemed to support. The battle still began because Muawiyah could not retreat without losing everything, and those who remained loyal to him were either the most devoted or the most greedy or the most blind, unwilling to see signs that were so obvious to others. The fighting lasted several days, was bloody, merciless, but its outcome was predetermined from the moment Zulfiqar began to glow, because an army fighting with belief that divine support is on their side fights with strength that ordinary courage, ordinary weapons cannot defeat. Ali himself fought, as always, in the front ranks, and those who were beside him recounted afterward that the sword in his hand did not cease glowing throughout the battle, that this green light was a beacon his warriors followed, toward which they strove, because where this light was, there was victory, there was protection, there was certainty they were on the right side, that their cause was just. The Battle of Siffin ended not in complete victory, but in arbitration, a strange, contradictory decision when both sides agreed to negotiations, though Ali's army had clear advantage, though victory was near. This decision split Ali's army. Part of his supporters, those who called themselves Kharijites, turned away from him, accusing him of weakness, of betrayal, of agreeing to human judgment in a matter that should have been decided by the sword, by divine judgment on the battlefield. The Kharijites left, formed their own group, began conducting raids on both Ali's army and Muawiyah's army, considering both traitors to true Islam, and the situation became ever more chaotic, ever more bloody. The Ummah was falling apart into factions, each considering itself the only righteous one, the only one following the true path. Ali tried to preserve unity, tried to reconcile different groups, but the task was impossible. Too much blood had been spilled, too many grievances had accumulated, too much ambition, greed, pride prevented people from seeing that they were destroying what the Prophet had built, destroying with their own hands, their own swords, their refusal to forgive, forget, begin anew. Zulfiqar hung at Ali's belt, but no longer glowed, had returned to its ordinary appearance, ordinary metal, and some said this was a sign that divine support had been withdrawn, that Allah had turned away from Muslims because they had turned away from His path, preferring power to unity, wealth to righteousness, revenge to forgiveness. Ali felt the weight of these years, the weight of responsibility for the Ummah that was falling apart before his eyes, which he could not save no matter how he tried. He aged rapidly, his hair turned almost completely gray, his face became covered with deep wrinkles, his eyes lost that fire that had burned in them in youth when he fought beside the Prophet, when everything was simple, clear enemies were there, beyond the front line, and friends here, nearby. Now it was impossible to distinguish friend from enemy because all were Muslims, all pronounced the Shahada, all prayed in one direction, but hated each other with hatred deeper, more painful than hatred of unbelievers, because betrayal by one's own wounds more strongly than enmity with strangers. In the year 41 of the Hijrah, early in the morning of the 19th of Ramadan, Ali came to the Kufa mosque for dawn prayer, as he did every day, despite warnings of assassination attempts, despite knowing that the Kharijites had sworn to kill him, had sworn to kill also Muawiyah and Amr ibn al-As, considering all three guilty of the Ummah's split. Ali did not hide, did not surround himself with guards, believed that if Allah had decided his time had come, then no guard would save him, and if it had not come, then no guard was needed, because no one can kill a person before his hour arrives, written in the heavens before the beginning of time. He entered the mosque, performed ablution, stood in the first row for prayer, and at this moment from the shadows emerged a man young, with a face distorted by fanaticism, with eyes in which there was nothing human, only cold certainty in his rightness, in that what he was about to do was pleasing to Allah, necessary for saving Islam from those who, as he believed, had betrayed it. The man's name was Abdurrahman ibn Muljam, and he was one of the Kharijites, one of those who had sworn to kill Ali, and the sword in his hand was special, not an ordinary blade, but a sword smeared with poison, the most deadly that could be found, poison for which there was no cure, which killed slowly, torturously, giving time to regret the deed, but not giving a chance to correct it. Ibn Muljam waited for the moment when Ali would bow in sajda, prostration, when he would be defenseless, and at this moment struck. The sword passed through defenses that were not there, plunged into Ali's head, split the skull, went deep, delivering poison directly into the brain, into the blood, spreading death through the body of the man who was one of the greatest warriors of Islam, one of the closest to the Prophet. A man who could have become the greatest caliph if the Ummah had been ready for his greatness, for his justice, for his incorruptibility. Ali fell. Blood gushed from the wound, flooded the prayer mat on which he stood, and people around screamed, rushed to him, seized Ibn Muljam, who did not try to flee, stood with bloodied sword in hand and smiled because he thought he had accomplished a great deed, that he had saved Islam, not understanding that he had committed one of the greatest crimes in history, had killed the man who was a bridge between the Prophet's generation and future generations, the last link with those times when Islam was pure, not contaminated by politics, power, wealth. Ali was still alive. Consciousness did not leave him immediately. He lay on the mosque floor, looked at the ceiling, at patterns that danced before his eyes. And the first thing he did was not cry out in pain, not curse the killer, but speak the words, by Rabbil Kabadi Fuztu. By the Lord of the Kaaba, I have succeeded. I have achieved the martyrdom I desired. Zulfiqar lay beside him, had fallen when Ali fell, and at the moment Ali spoke these words, something happened that all present in the mosque saw, that could not be hallucination, that was real, tangible, horrifying. The sword lying on the floor in a pool of its master's blood suddenly trembled, began to vibrate, and from it burst a sound, not metallic clanging, not ringing, but something resembling a scream, a wail, a sound that a piece of metal cannot make, but which was so human, so full of pain and rage, that those who heard it covered their ears, fell to their knees, unable to bear this sonic agony. The sword cracked. Right down the middle of the blade, the crack ran from point to hilt, dividing the forked blade into two halves, and the crack widened until the sword broke completely into two pieces that fell in different directions, and the sound stopped as suddenly as it began, leaving silence ringing in ears. Silence that was louder than any scream. Ali lived for 2 more days after the attack, 2 days of agonizing torment while the poison did its work, destroying the body from within, burning organs, stopping functions one after another. He did not lose consciousness, remained lucid until the end, gave final instructions to his sons, Hassan and Hussein, asked them not to avenge him, not to start a new war, not to spill more Muslim blood, because the Ummah had had enough blood, enough pain, enough division. He spoke of forgiveness, that his killer should be punished according to law, but no more than that, not with torture, not with humiliation, with one sword stroke, quick, merciful, because even a killer deserves mercy and death. He spoke of Zulfiqar, of how the sword had broken because its time to serve had ended, because there was no longer a warrior worthy of bearing it, because the era when justice could be defended by the sword had come to an end. A new era was beginning, darker, where the sword would serve not truth, but power, not justice, but ambition. When Ali died, at dawn of the 21st of Ramadan, at the age of 63 years, the entire Islamic world was shaken. Even his enemies, even those who had fought against him, acknowledged that a great man had died, that an epoch had passed, that never again would there be such a caliph, such a warrior, such a judge who would prefer justice to his own benefit, who slept on the floor, ate barley bread, wore patched clothing though he was ruler of an empire stretching from Egypt to Persia, who distributed everything from the treasury to the needy, keeping nothing for himself, for his family. He was buried secretly at night in a place known only to the closest, because they feared enemies would desecrate the grave, that the Kharijites who killed him would try to destroy even his remains in their blind hatred. The two halves of Zulfiqar were lifted from the mosque floor, washed of the blood, and Ali's sons tried to join them, but could not. The metal would not fuse. The two halves would not connect, as if between them was an invisible force repelling one from the other. They invited the best blacksmiths, the best metalworkers from Damascus, from Persia, from India, but no one could do what seemed simple: join two parts of one sword. Master said it was impossible, that the metal had changed, that it was no longer ordinary steel, but something else, something that did not obey ordinary laws of forging, smelting, welding. Some said the sword was cursed, that it should not be touched, that it needed to be buried with its master, but others said the opposite, that the sword was sacred, that it had been blessed, that it broke not from weakness, but from grief, from impossibility of continuing to exist in a world where its master was killed treacherously in a mosque during prayer in the sacred month of Ramadan. The two halves of Zulfiqar were preserved, passed from generation to generation in Ali's family, kept as relics, as reminders of the time when those lived who had seen the Prophet, who had fought with him, who had heard the Quran from his mouth. From time to time, rumors appeared that someone had managed to join the halves, that the sword was whole again, but each time it turned out to be a lie, that the two halves remained divided, lay in different places, because those who kept them decided it was safer to keep them apart so no one could obtain both pieces and attempt to restore the sword for their purposes, which most likely would be far from those noble purposes for which Zulfiqar had served Ali. Stories about the sword continued to spread, accumulating new details, some true, some exaggerated, some completely invented, but all converged on one thing. Zulfiqar was not merely a weapon. It was a symbol of justice that cannot be deceived, that knows the difference between right and wrong, between innocent and guilty, and that refuses to serve injustice even if injustice is committed in the name of good, in the name of faith, in the name of defending Islam. A sword that could distinguish good from evil, that glowed when its master was right, that became heavy when the master erred, that broke when its master was killed, not in honest combat, not in battle where one could defend oneself, but treacherously from behind, with a poisoned blade that gave no chance even to draw one's sword and die as a warrior, but forced him to die defenseless, in prayer, in a position of complete submission to Allah. Centuries passed. The Islamic world continued to expand, fragment, reunite, pass through golden ages and dark times, through periods of enlightenment and periods of fanaticism, and the story of Zulfiqar remained alive, passed from generation to generation, told in madrasas, in mosques, in homes where elders shared with grandchildren stories of great people of the past, of times when Islam was young, pure, not corrupted by power, wealth, those things that destroy religions from within more strongly than any external enemies. The legend of the sword that could distinguish good from evil became a metaphor, used by preachers to teach about justice, about how Allah sees all, knows intentions, that it is impossible to deceive him with external piety, formal performance of rituals, that he looks at the heart, and if the heart is black, full of malice, greed, hypocrisy, then no prayers, no fasts, no pilgrimages will help. In the 19th century, when the Ottoman Empire was on the verge of collapse, when European powers were dividing the Islamic world among themselves like slicing a cake, when it seemed Islam as a political force was approaching its end, a man appeared who claimed he had found both halves of Zulfiqar, that he had managed to join them using ancient knowledge lost to modern blacksmiths, knowledge transmitted to him by a secret order preserving relics of Islam's first centuries. This man, a dervish named Mehmed Effendi, traveled through Anatolia, Syria, Egypt, showing the sword he claimed was Zulfiqar, telling stories of its power, of miracles it performed, and many believed him because they wanted to believe, because they needed a symbol, hope, something that would remind them of glorious times when Islam was strong, when Muslims were not colonized, humiliated, divided. But there were skeptics too, scholars, historians who examined Mehmed Effendi's sword and declared it a forgery, skillful, made by a master blacksmith who knew how to age metal, how to create the appearance of antiquity, but still a forgery, because the metal was ordinary steel, without those strange properties described in sources, without that inner glow, without that energy felt by those who touched the real Zulfiqar. Mehmed Effendi disappeared as suddenly as he appeared, and his sword disappeared too, perhaps destroyed, perhaps hidden somewhere among other forgeries, other false relics created by those who exploit people's faith, their desire to touch the sacred history, something greater than themselves. The real halves of Zulfiqar, if they existed at all, if the entire story was not legend from the beginning, remained somewhere in private collections, in museums, perhaps not even identified, lying among other ancient swords, distinguished by nothing, because their power, if it existed, left with their master, with the era when justice still mattered, when people believed a sword could serve truth and not only power. In the 20th century, in the era of world wars when millions died from weapons that did not distinguish innocent from guilty, that killed indiscriminately entire cities, entire peoples, the idea of a sword that refused to kill an innocent person seemed naive, childish, belonging to a world that no longer existed, if it ever had. But in the 21st century, when archaeologists conducted excavations in Iraq, at the site of ancient Kufa, where once stood the mosque in which Ali was killed, they stumbled upon a cache hidden beneath the floor, about which there were no records in any historical sources. The cache contained various 7th century artifacts, coins, jewelry, weapons, and among this weaponry were 2 pieces of a sword, a forked sword, which even after 14 centuries in the earth showed no signs of corrosion, rust, decomposition that usually destroy metal buried so long. The metal was dark, almost black, but when cleaned, it turned out that beneath the surface layer, it had an unusual pattern, wavy, resembling Damascus steel, but more complex, more subtle, created by a technique modern metallurgists could not identify, could not reproduce. Scientists studying these pieces were puzzled because the chemical composition of the metal did not correspond to any known alloy of that time, contained elements in proportions that should not have been possible with 7th century technologies, even contained traces of elements rare on Earth, usually found in meteorites, in objects of extraterrestrial origin. This spawned theories that Zulfiqar was made from meteoritic iron, which would explain its unique properties, its resistance to corrosion, its strength, perhaps even its ability to glow, if the metal contained elements that under certain conditions, under the action of body heat, adrenaline, the human body's electric field, could fluoresce, emit light. The 2 sword pieces found in Kufa were transferred to the Baghdad Museum, where they were placed in a special display case under strict guard, because if these truly were parts of Zulfiqar, their value was immeasurable, not in monetary terms, though collectors offered millions, but in cultural, historical, spiritual terms, because this was a connection to one of Islam's greatest men, to a man whose life and death shaped the religion, divided it into branches whose effects are felt to this day, 14 centuries later. News of the discovery spread through the Islamic world, caused enormous interest but also disputes, because if this truly is Zulfiqar, to whom should it belong? To Shiites, for whom Ali was the first Imam, the Prophet's legitimate successor? To Sunnis, who respect Ali as the fourth rightly guided caliph, but do not give him that special status Shiites bestow upon him? To the Iraqi government, on whose territory the sword was found, or to the entire Islamic world as common heritage that should not belong to one group, one sect, one country. Disputes continued, became ever more fierce. Political and religious leaders used the discovery to advance their agendas, their interpretations of history, their claims that precisely their group were the true heirs of the first Muslims. The museum where the sword pieces were kept became a pilgrimage site. Thousands came to see the relic, touch the display case glass, pray beside what they believed was the weapon of one of Islam's greatest saints. Museum guards told strange things, said that sometimes, late at night when the museum was empty, they heard sounds coming from the room where the sword was kept. Sounds resembling metallic ringing, vibration, something an inanimate object cannot make. And when they checked, they found the sword pieces had shifted in the display case, though the case was sealed. No one had opened it, touched the contents. One of the guards, an elderly man who had worked at the museum for 20 years, recounted that one night he saw the sword pieces glow with that same green light described in historical sources, light that cannot come from ordinary metal, light that was weak, barely noticeable, but undoubtedly real. Not hallucination, not play of shadows, but genuine luminescence that lasted several minutes, then faded, leaving the guard standing in darkness, trembling not from fear, but from awe before what he had seen, before proof that legends are not always only legends, that sometimes they are based on reality, on events that exceed ordinary understanding, that hint that the world is larger, more complex, more filled with mysteries than we are ready to acknowledge. Scientists tried to explain the glow, if it truly existed, spoke of bacterial bioluminescence, of phosphorescence of certain minerals in the metal, of numerous natural causes that could create the illusion of glowing, but no explanation was fully satisfactory, could not account for all details, all evidence, the entire context in which the discovery was made, in which the legend was born 14 centuries ago. And in the end, as often happens with such things, the mystery remained a mystery, not solved, not fully explained, leaving room for faith, for interpretation, for each person who looked at these pieces of ancient metal to decide for themselves what they represent, what they mean, whether they truly were Zulfiqar, the sword that distinguished good from evil, or simply ordinary weapons that legend transformed into something greater, because people need legends, need symbols, need faith, that justice is real, that it can be defended, that it has power, even in a world where it seems strength and justice rarely go hand in hand. The two pieces of Zulfiqar lie in the museum to this day, separated, unable to be joined, as was predicted 14 centuries ago when the sword broke from grief, when its master was treacherously killed by a man who thought he was serving truth, but served only his blind certainty, his fanaticism, which could not see that he was killing not an enemy, but one of faith's greatest defenders, a man who lived and died for principles that should have been Islam's heart, but which were forgotten, betrayed, buried under layers of politics, power, sectarian hatred. The sword remains a symbol, a reminder of a time that perhaps never existed as purely as we remember it, but to which we aspire, a time when justice was not merely a word, but reality, when weapons could distinguish right from wrong, when warriors fought not for power, not for wealth, but for principles, for faith, for what they believed was truth, even if that truth cost them their lives, as it cost Ali, as it cost many others whose names are inscribed in history as martyrs, as heroes, as saints, as those who paid the ultimate price for refusing to bow before injustice, before falsehood, before compromise with conscience.